first chapter, you've like laid down the tracks for implications that are going to take you know not where. So I'm hoping that I can kind of draw you into that theoretical story a little bit. You can see the drama and also see where that's wrapped up with the practices. You know, where along the way are the practices, and you can begin to ask yourself where they're going to go next if that theoretical story unfolds. Now I hope I can lay this out, but I'm sort of going to lay it out as a timeline story, in which, and some of you know this because you've heard me lecture before, but others not, where you begin with sort of the last 300 years of Western tradition, where in particular science has been attempting to tell us about the nature of the world. So you begin with an independent world out there composed of, let's say, objects or domains, which could include the economy, the cosmos, people like us, whatever, organizations, and so on. And you've got an independent observer who's taking all that in, who's trying to think about it, and who then shares the words with others. So you've got a Galileo looking at the world for what it is, thinking about it, charting its nature, and then telling us in a document about the nature of the universe. Now, that's been pretty much the last 300 years. It's been most of our major philosophers. Most of major philosophy and science is based on a relationship between person and world. Now, what has happened in the last 20, 30 years of the last century was a lot of people began to challenge that view and began to ask, well, all right, let's look at the word, which looked like just the kind of endpoint of all that. Looked like just the sharing, not very important in itself, and say, where do the words come from? Because they weren't just read off the world. I mean, it's like you watch, and somehow the world is there, and you've got a word for it. So where do the words come from? And slowly, and I won't go into the whole thing, and what I'm doing here is about 30 years of thought, boiled down into 7 minutes, so give me a break. But you begin to realize that the words are created by people in relationship. Language is quintessentially a product of relatedness. So in effect, and if you press that out further, you realize that that observer must be coming out of some kind of relational community, informed by that community, observing the world in its terms. And without that community, there would be no terms, there would be no assumptions with which to approach it. Or to say that you can talk about the world in one perspective or another. But what if you have no perspective? What can you say? Now, if you take that seriously, the Western tradition for 300 years was essentially world, person, word. What you're doing in social construction is totally reversing that set of premises. So you begin with the set of relationships out of which the person comes as a relational partner, approaching whatever it is we're taking to be the world in terms that we have already developed within relationships. So it's a major shift in terms of our philosophical traditions in the West. All right, now out of that shift come three different kinds of practices. Deconstructive, which pretty much occupied most minority groups and a lot of scholars for about 20 years, and it still goes on. That is undermining all the authority for the last 300 years and challenging it as constructions and asking whose constructions are these, what are the political agendas that underlie them, who gains and who loses by those particular constructions. That's a very liberating exercise. Then there's a reconstruction which says, okay, look, those are optional accounts that we have, so perhaps we can develop other accounts. We're liberated to do that. And something like narrative therapy would be a reconstructive error. We can take the bad story, we can rework that story into something else. And then what's primarily going on here, and I think that's pretty much where we are now, is much more a creative process of generating futures. So you take a group of people and you set in motion this process of generating together language, and you try to move somewhere, you try to create some future. This is design, this is AI, let us talk together and move. This is collaborative therapy, let us talk together and go someplace. It's narrative mediation, let us talk together and move in a direction of some kind. It is dialogic classrooms, let us move towards another educational unfolding, and so on. But things don't stop there, at least if you're reflecting on this, because you have to ask yourself, well, what account can you give of that process? Now, what is a relationship so that we can understand what we're doing? How to think about relationship. And we got a problem, because in the Western tradition, relationships are between independent beings. That's what we mean by relationship, is two or more people coming together. It's something you build, not something that's natural. And we got a problem here, because on the first account, we've already deconstructed the person. Because by the very nature of the process of relating, we have created a conception of a person. And there are multiple conceptions, we understand that. So you can't begin the process of relating with the independent individual, because that's already a construction. And then what? And for me, that's sort of been taken me into the relational being book, trying to understand how you could talk about process without independent individuals. And as many of you will know, what I tried to do with that was to say, look, let's look at every meaningful act as requiring both an action of some kind, let's say, we'll call it a person for a moment, and then some kind of supplement. The other picks it up, does something with it. So there's nothing I can say or no action I can perform that is anything until you do something with it. Until you affirm it as something, until you take it up and do something with it, question it, repeat it, use it in some way so that it becomes something. At that point you begin to say, well, look, I am nothing until you pick me up and create me, co-create me. But on the other hand, you can't co-create me without my doing anything. So the quintessential origin of all meaning is in the coordination, not in the person, but in that coordinative activity, which I call co-action. Now, things don't stop there, because you say, well, all right, now what's that going to do? If that process is central, process is central, and you're going to begin to say it process, as I mentioned before, precedes person. So process becomes that which we need to attend to. But what is that going to mean? Well, it takes me in several directions, and this begins to be towards what I find is the cutting edge. Some of it has been in some of the discussions here already. And that is whatever we're going to call understanding is not going to be contained in the words. So understanding's got to be something more like engaging in the process, out of which the words may become a skill or an outcome, but it's the engagement in the process which is primary. So it's like saying learning the abstract words about, let's say, relationships isn't going to do relationships. It's more like you've got to be there, you've got to be in it. So that coming up to conclusions here isn't going to take us far enough, because you've got to prepare for an ongoing process which is going to be continuous, as action, supplement, relations continue. I may do something, you do something to supplement it, but your supplement becomes an action of which I am now the next person who picks it up. And that process is continuous. So there's no end point. And simply talking isn't understanding, it's being in the action. This raises a question about, for example, education. Learning something that's fixed isn't particularly useful because everything is in motion. Evaluating either a practice like AI, or a leadership program, or an educational circle isn't enough, because everything is going to continue to change. So it means, like, if you're going to do evaluation, it's going to become something like formative. That is, it's more like feedback on the way somewhere, as opposed to summative, where you simply, that worked or didn't work. More like checking out among a number of people about how it's working, because it's going to be continuously in motion. It's to say, for me in therapy, to think more about not what we know about ourselves or my situation or the problem or what I could do about it, but how can I come out of therapy or any other activity as a being who can continuously relate with a continuously changing process, more like flowing with than being something. I'm playing at the edges here. Like, really thought this out carefully. All right, so I move then towards you may say non-verbal, but that's not quite right. That is, I'm interested in total action, being in the process, whether it's verbal or not, total being with. And if you take that out in an even further direction, you begin to say, well, look, how can I understand the process? Because all I've got are words. And the words were the product of the process. So I can't really penetrate or own the process by virtue of description, because all I've got is what it's given me, which is constructed in a time and a place. So I have then to say, well, okay, this is just a way of looking at it, and there may be other ways, but we can never like have the process as a piece of knowledge, because it will always be beyond us, any particular instruction. Now, at that point, we're going to move into this sort of metaphysical space where you begin to think, feel with a certain awe. Here we are engaged in a process out of which we've come, out of which everything we come, out of which all conceptions of reality and reason and good and so on emerge, and we can't grasp it. We are, in that sense, out of control. But it's also a process of which we could be awe-inspired. It's like everything created within the space in which we exist, and you could begin to sort of make a connection with a lot of spiritual traditions in which you can't specify whatever it is that's sacred, because you can't own it in the words. It has its own existence, which is greater than our understanding. So you move into kind of a spiritual domain, sort of a mystical sense of total co-creation. It's a little bit like the Buddhist notion of interbeing. You can't put it into words, you can only join it in some way in meditation. That's one direction that you move, and there's another one which, again, for me is sort of like at the cutting edge of my thought right now. I'm going to call it confluence. Now, from what we've done here, we can deconstruct the idea of cause and effect, which is sort of we've inherited from past tradition. It is a conception, it's a construction, and it's not a particularly good one if you're in the process, because what cause and effect does is to begin to divide the world into pieces again. So we're all caused by, or affected by, or deciding. I mean, it's all about independent entities colliding with each other. So we give that up as a form of explanation. And try to think, again, I'm right at the edge of where I'm sort of pondering these days, how we could understand and talk about things in terms of the flowing together, the way in which an organization or a family or a conference and so on is generated by the flowing together of a whole lot of things which are going to coexist for a time and then perhaps move on. I hate to talk about it as components, because now I'm back in independence, but I don't have any other language to use except unitized language. But it's trying to get a grasp of how we could think of flows for a time which at a particular point of time really work in a smooth and significant way, and from which we go on now carrying that process with us. We are part of those flows carrying it into other spaces of existence. So that's sort of my theoretical journey, and I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But thank you very much.